Okay, World War One.
This is chapter, we're starting off with
This is chapter chapter 22, World War One. Now, on a personal note, the older men and women were all veterans of World War II when I was growing up. Now, right now, I know World War II veterans are dying faster than they did during the war, but they were veterans of World War II. And I remember one time I asked my mother, "Mom, was there ever a World War I?" Oh, yeah, she said, yes, there was a World War I. Her father almost got called up to it, but the war ended quickly before he got called up. Her father was a farm worker, and that might have helped keep him out for a while. But anyway, he was on the verge of getting called up. Now, my other grandfather actually served. But anyway, there was a World War I, but we in the United States did not see much of it. Not so Europe. World War I changed Europe more than World War II. World War I ended the rule of the Royal House of Russia, completely destroyed the Ottoman Empire, ended the Royal House of Austria, ended the Royal House of Germany. 4 royal houses were brought down during World War I, as well as it ended a lot of the rule of the nobility in the places like Austria and Germany, places that were defeated, and yes, in Russia too. So World War I really brought a lot of changes to Europe and killed and multiplied millions of Europeans, while the United States lost approximately 50,000 men. Nevertheless, World War I was by far the worst war in history up to that time. World War I was called the war to end all wars. Since World War I began, there has not been 1 second on this planet where there has not been a war going on somewhere. Yes, the United States is involved in wars right now. One in Afghanistan, and still, I believe, you might say we're in Iraq. That's debatable. I mean, we're there, but are we still fighting again? But in Afghanistan, these wars do not seem to end anymore. War to end all wars. It was called the war to make the world safe for democracy, and a few other things it was called. It was hoped would serve, but none of them came out. George Brown, your book opens up with a big net. George Brown was a black man who served along with 2 million American men, most of whom came home from the war. He was an engineer, wounded. Basically, what did he do? He dug trenches, or helped dig trenches. He was wounded but survived the war. The war changed the United States in a couple of ways. Women finally got the right to vote. Here's how. When the war was going on, every young man was expected to register for the draft. More than 4 million young men put on uniforms. And that meant somebody had to stay home and take care of the factories. Now, I had someone ask, how did the war end? Well, during wartime, you don't have depression. During the war, everybody who wants to work works. If you want a job, you just go to the nearest factory. If they won't hire, the next factory will. Within the first day you go looking for work, you'll find work. Factories even go so far as to try to steal each other's workers. So, okay, come over here, we'll treat you better than they do. Yes?
It's interesting you say that, because I have uncles who are still alive, and they would have, literally, I couldn't understand how he had 2 full-time jobs. He worked for like GM, and he worked, I think, for Ford. And I'm like, well, how do you do that? And then he had like a part-time job throwing trash or picking up trash. And I'm like, and these jobs paid well.
Yeah.
How do you do that? But it was just like he was saying, it was towards the end of that era where you can just go, like, if this job's treating you wrong, you can go right across the street and go to the job at the other plant and still be employed. So,
Yeah. That's
I couldn't
a
believe
good point. But anyone who wants to work did work. And the pay was usually good because the factories were trying to steal it. And the factories knew everything they made was going to be sold to the government.
Yeah.
So the shoe factories began making military boots. And your automobile factories started making tanks and army trucks and army jeeps. Things like that. And of course, the airplane factories started making military planes. Everybody worked, and including the women. They hired women, and women then began, particularly this was more true in Europe. In Europe, factories were run 90% by women, and women even became bosses and foremen. Now, some men were too old for the draft. Some men were too old for the Army. All right, let me explain. All right. The Army in those days, all right, so for the draft, everyone from 21 to 35 had to register for the draft. Now, the Army took volunteers as young as 17 if you had your parents' consent, 18 without your parents' consent, and up to 45 if you were physically fit and able. They would take you up to 45. After 45, the Army didn't want you. Now, the German Army got to where they were taking 11-year and 12-year-old boys. That was in World War II. And the Confederate Army was taking old gray-haired men during a Civil War and losing badly with them, I must say. Again, well, I'll tell you something. You get to a certain point, you start breathing hard much faster. I can't run 5 or 6 steps without stopping to breathe hard. What's wrong with you? Oh, I just ran up the stairs. Now, when I was in my 30s, but that was when I was in my 30s. But you wear out, and also your injuries take a lot longer to heal. That's why you have to quit playing ball after a certain time. Get banged really hard, or a ball hits you right and moves your thumb back. It won't heal for the entire, because you keep hurting it over and over and over again. Now, of course, some of you young people have no idea what I'm talking about.
I know.
Not yet, you will. Anyway. But anyway, they took volunteers up to 45, but everyone 21 to 35 had to register for selective service, and basically that meant you were called up. 4 million men answered the call. The Army still has a mandatory retirement age of 60, and that applies to everyone except for maybe generals who are allowed to serve beyond that point. I'm not sure about that, though, but today there is no draft. But we'll talk more about that as the semester goes.
When did they stop that?
The draft stopped in 1973, right about the time I got out of college, when they decided to go with an all-volunteer Army. And owing to the fact, and your book will mention this, soldiers who were drafted out to where they used drugs, and they started fragging, that is, beating up or shooting their officers dead, their superior officers, and discipline really, really got bad. So the all-volunteer Army solved a lot of the problem of discipline, thanks to men like Dr. Spock, whom I'll talk about possibly later, who was an expert on child rearing, but his 5 sons say he was a lousy daddy. This actually has happened. After he died, his 5 sons all unanimously said he was a bad father.
How does that happen?
Basically, he was a child rearing expert. All right. Who believed in permissiveness and let the child have his own way. Now, I'm exaggerating, but he did not actually say that. I'm going to exaggerate for effect. If the child throws a temper tantrum and breaks the kitchen table, what the family ought to do is just eat off the floor for a while until the child learns that it's not a good idea to throw a tantrum and break tables. Now, he did not actually say this, but in effect, this is where some of his people like him did actually go that far. And all of you, again, after you think the child has learned that he should not go around and throwing a tantrum and breaking a table, then he can replace the table that he broke. Permissiveness. Let the child have his own way, let the child do his own thing. Spanking was taboo. And then when the children went haywire, Dr. Spock said, no, really, I've always advocated firmness with children. No, we didn't. Nevertheless, he got a bad name after a while.
Now, how does he correlate with this chapter?
Not this chapter. I'm talking what happened later. I was asked, why did we stop the draft? It was due to the fact that the young men could not be disciplined anymore. And believe me, my daughter's a teacher. I was a teacher for all public schools.
Why would they beat their superior officers up in the war and stuff?
Okay. We're a little bit off the subject, not far off. I'm glad you asked that, though. They were, from the time they were little, they were used to having their own way and being allowed to do their own thing. And anytime someone crossed them up, they beat up anyone who crossed them up because their parents had allowed them to do whatever they wanted to.
So they had authority issues?
They had super authority issues. And this began when I was Well, basically, all right, here's what the older teachers would tell me. That the lack of discipline in school started in 1955 or thereabout. That was the year I started school. It took another nosedive in 1962. Then I graduated in 67. They say it really took another nosedive in 1972. And that was about the time the Supreme Court made decisions that almost completely outlawed any kind of dress codes. And it's now known that if you make the children dress up, they're going to behave better and they're going to learn more.
It's funny because people don't believe that, but if you go right now, go around, I can show you about like almost 20 schools in Cobb County School District right now where they went back to the dress code, and what happened, the violence in that school has went down by 80%. 80%, because what happens is that you have the gang problem, the violence has went down 80% in the school.
I believe
It's
it.
factual.
I believe it.
It's factual.
And also, I mean, I know a lot of your teachers, men teachers, will come to school dressed in blue jeans and dirty, ragged blue jeans and tennis shoes. I don't. Again, I feel like that's unprofessional, but they do it, including, I mean, I've seen department heads come to school dressed in ragged blue jeans and tennis shoes. I think that's unprofessional, folks. And I really believe that teachers get more respect. I mean, at one time, college professors had to wear gowns. Then it got to where they had to wear a suit and tie. But I'd be laughed at if I wore a suit and tie, but at least I try to dress a little bit. All right, but anyway, but again, then I got into the teaching in 1973, and by that time, I mean, I was appalled at what I'd seen go downhill between 1967 when I graduated from high school to 1973 when I got back in. I couldn't. I tried to handle it and I couldn't. I lasted 5 years, long enough to pay half my college loan. I borrowed $1,400, both from UT and Lee, paid back $700 of it legally because of the law on the book that they tell me is still on the books that if you teach, the government will forgive part of your loan. So every year the government forgave 10% of my loan up to 50%. Then I got out. Got a job at the factory. No, I'll tell you something now. My wife ran into a woman who was sweeping floors at the mall. She said, I was once a teacher, but I would rather be doing this because I get more respect as a janitor at the mall than I got as a public school teacher. Okay, I see at least a couple of you that understand. Again, lack of discipline. Sheer lack of discipline. All right. George Brown. Oh, yeah, so now, two things. Women's rights came out of the war. Women got the right to vote, and prohibition also came out of the war. But also, your book says so did intolerance. Now, before we proceed, I'm going to say this. From this point on, you're going to see me, for the first time this semester, disagreeing with the authors of your book more and more. Your authors take extremely liberal stances on everything. And as we come to each of these things, all right, folk, I want to be practical. You cannot allow dissent in time of war. In time of war, you must suspend your Bill of Rights. Argue with me if you want to. We didn't during the Vietnam War and we lost. We suspended our rights in World War I and we won. So did Great Britain, so did Germany, so did both sides during the Civil War. We suspended a lot of our Bill of Rights in World War II. We suspended a lot of the Constitution, suspended the freedom to dissent, and we won it. In Vietnam, we allowed people to just protest the war, and it gave our enemies courage to keep on fighting. We lost. But your book makes it sound like, oh, it was so bad that we quashed dissent, which we did. Wilson had spent his life dealing with American issues. I mean, he was an isolationist like everyone else at the time was. But circumstances forced him to finally turn his attention abroad. When it came to Latin America, Wilson appointed a pacifist, William Jennings Bryan. Keep his name, we've already talked about him. He was the silver-tongued orator. He was the one who spoke for free silver, ran for president 3 times and lost all 3 times. But he was a pacifist, and Wilson made him Secretary of State. Yet, in spite of that, Wilson wound up sending troops to Latin America more than once. his most serious intervention came in Mexico. Now, folk, I may have told this story already. I've got permission from my two sisters to tell this, but when I was 18 years old, my two sisters, aged 10 and 8, got into a fight. The 10-year-old was beating up pretty badly on the 8-year-old, and I thought I'd intervene on behalf of the younger one. Well, the next thing I knew, both of the girls were pounding on me. What does this have to do with Latin America? Everything. It has everything to do with the Middle East also. You try to help one side and wind up alienating every side. This is what we've done in Latin America throughout most of the 20th century. But anyway, in Mexico, they had a civil war. They finally elected actually they had a dictator. The dictator was forced out of office, particularly after Wilson refused to recognize it. The other nations of the world recognized this dictator who had taken over by military means, got control of the army, and took over at gunpoint. Wilson said, well, we aren't going to recognize you, and Wilson sent troops down to Mexico, got the dictator to flee. And so Mexico elected a president. But the poor people rose up, led by Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa overthrew the elected president, took over. Pancho Villa then killed some Americans in Mexico, then crossed into the American border and killed a bunch of Americans on the American side of the border. So President Wilson sent John Joseph Pershing to capture Villa. Well, Pershing went into Mexico himself, looked all around. He never did capture Villa. Finally, Pershing was called home because the United States got involved in a war with Germany. Keep in mind, Mexico was not our friend. Now, this is going to become important before the lesson is out, because Germany made an offer to Mexico that you might think Mexico would have taken them up on, but they didn't. But anyway, Villa escaped. He was smarter than Pershing, that much we know for sure. Now, keep Pershing in mind because he was the general who was in command of the American army in World War I. Same man, but he could not capture Villa. Now, Europe. Europe had been at peace for decades. In fact, Europe had not really had a major war since 1815, the Napoleonic Wars. The reason for that was their diplomats maintained a balance of power. But then when Italy united and Germany united, that somewhat upset the balance. So the nations of Europe began to make secret treaties. And in other words, now the main treaty I want you to notice is Russia had a treaty with Serbia. Russia had this treaty with Serbia, and France had a treaty with Russia. Britain had a treaty with Belgium. In the meantime, Germany had a treaty with Austria.
Is this what the book talk about, that triple alliance deal or something?
They would mount up on two sides. Now, this was one side here. This is the other side. Now, the one side was a triple alliance, the other was a triple entente. The triple entente was the Germany-Austria side. And anyway, they had lined themselves up, and this was setting things up right for war. To this day, I mean, right now, Europe is still lined up. There's the NATO nations and the Warsaw Pact nations. The Warsaw Pact is somewhat dissolved, but it could still come together. But anyway, there's NATO, so we still have treaty alliances. They had them then. Well, there was a lot of Europeans on edge, particularly the little nations in Europe were lining themselves up with a bigger nation. And this was true. Serbia lined itself with a big nation. Belgium lined itself up with a big nation. Russia and France were both considered big. Anyway, a Serbian terrorist killed the heir to Austria's throne. It was in the summer of 1914. And this created a whole lot of worry and sleeplessness all over Europe because the Europeans realized, oh boy, this could lead to trouble. Austria made demands on Serbia that Serbia could not meet. Essentially what had happened, these countries were itching. You might say, they were itching for a fight, almost begging for a fight. Partly it was because the kings of Europe, they weren't dictators, they were actually divine right kings, could see their power slipping away. And it felt like if they had a war, the people would rally to them and they would become real kings once again, like build up the power. Like if they could have seen the results, they would not have been eager for war. I mean, if the Tsar of Russia could have seen him and his family lined up in front of a firing squad and their bodies thrown into a mud puddle for 70 years, he might not have wanted war. And if the Kaiser of Germany could have seen himself hoeing a garden like an ordinary man, pauper basically, he might not have wanted war. But nevertheless, they thought they wanted war. Each side they believed they could win. Well, make a long story short, Austria declared war on Serbia. And at that point, Russia declared war on Austria. Then Germany declared war on Russia. France, siding with Russia, declared war on Germany. Everybody thought, okay, it was true the American Civil War had lasted 4 years, but the few wars we'd had in Europe in the last 100 years have been short. The Crimean War, 1 or 2 battles and it was over with. The Franco-Prussian War, 1 battle and it was over with. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where Germany defeated France, was over with in 1 battle. Everybody thought that it would be a short war. Again, if they could have seen 6 or 7 million people being killed. What delayed the outcome of the war was the trench. They'd get in the trenches and neither side could whip the other from the trenches. Every once in a while they'd go to the top. These troops would shoot a lot of rounds, heavy artillery, machine gun fire at the enemy. Then they'd all jump over the top, but they'd be mowed down while they tried to get to enemy territory. And the trenches also would cave in when it rained, and that killed a lot of people. The trench proved to be the worst, and yet nobody knew the solution to it. I mean, you had to fight in the trench because the machine guns were so deadly and the artillery was so deadly that humanity could not stand it otherwise. Now, in World War II, it was different. The tank and the plane, but planes in World War I were rather crude by comparison, and the tank was barely invented during World War I. But the trench warfare stalled everything and guaranteed the war would go on and on and on and on and on. All right, now, the United States. The United States wanted to keep out of the war, so they practiced what we call neutrality. But that was easier said than done. A recession occurred in our country. About the time the war began, we had an economic downturn. To get our economy lifted up, we had to trade with Europe. So Wilson said, the United States is neutral, we're going to trade even with both sides. Britain, which controlled the sea, said, no, you're going to trade with us and nobody else. So Britain would not allow us to trade with Germany, so we began trading with Britain. We felt we had to get our economy going back up. So we traded with Britain for a while. Well, Germany did not have a big navy, but Germany resorted to attacking us with U-boats. Undersea boats or submarines. And the Germans sank a lot of ships. And it was justifiable because they were at war with Britain, and any nation trading with Great Britain, the Germans felt justified in sinking their ships. That's wrote U-boat, by the way, for those of you craning your neck to look at it. So this, now, I was asked one time, why did the United States finally side with Germany? There are a couple of reasons. Number one, we spoke the same language as Great Britain did. Oh yeah, yes. And Great Britain had sided with France, owing to the fact that Germany went through Belgium to get to France, and Belgium had this treaty with Britain, So that drew Britain into the war, a treaty that they made about 100 years before. So Britain got involved in a war too. Anyway, the sinking of American shipping got a lot of Americans to turn against Germany, even though, keep in mind, Germany had a lot of its people living in the United States. A lot of Americans were of German descent. Nevertheless, Germany was a monarchy, Britain was a democracy, and the United States was a democracy itself. And France had helped us during the Revolution, so that kind of put us on the side with Britain and France. And also, Russia had offered to help fight for the North during the Civil War. So Russia at this time was our friend. We had also purchased Alaska from Russia. So Russia was somewhat of our friend. So we decided on the side of this alliance here, Russia, Serbia, France, and Britain. We had leanings that way, but there was enough, and also the Germans were sinking U-boat. But then there was another event that occurred later that really got us on the British side. Anyway, we continued to supply money towards Britain, to Britain and France. Finally, though, there was the most famous sinking of all, the sinking of the Lusitania.
Not a U-boat, right?
By a U-boat. Now, here's the story of the Lusitania, folk. Again, some of this might come from books on conspiracy theory, but your book mentions... All right, I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. Recently, the Lusitania was found. A bunch of divers want to go down and pick, and look over it before it disintegrated. The British government said, no, we won't allow it. It is believed that the Lusitania was carrying armaments. Your book mentions that.
He's carrying what?
Armaments, and other weapons, ammunition. All right. When the Lusitania was about to leave for the port of New York to go to Britain, nobody wanted to sign the paperwork to clear it. So, you might say that everybody passed the buck. Both Harry Truman and Jimmy Carter had a sign on the president's desk. There at your office says, the buck stops here. Well, everybody, when I was at Lockheed, I would do it sometimes. Oops, this is a bigger decision I need to make. Even when I was teaching, oops, I better get the principal involved in this. I better get him because this is big for me. I had one girl, somebody said, this girl has taken a whole bottle of her medicines. I didn't know how to handle that when I was about 24 years old. So I asked the principal to handle it, let him handle that. He finally became convinced she hadn't actually done it. But anyway, you get a big case. Well, anyway, nobody wanted to sign the paperwork, so it wound up all the way to President Wilson's desk. President Wilson signed the paperwork, so it went back down the chain of command. The Lusitania is cleared for sailing. Lusitania carried many passengers, including more than 100 Americans. It also is now believed to have carried armaments. The Germans somehow knew. They got word that Lusitania was carrying armaments to Britain, so they sunk it.
Was a torpedo?
Again, it was a justifiable sinking. It was an act of war in time of a declared war. A lot of Americans became upset. Now, a lot of people who don't study it that close think we went to war on account of the sinking of Lusitania. In actual reality, we didn't. We delayed the war a while. Now, in the meantime, an election occurred. Woodrow Wilson won the election of 1916 with a campaign slogan of, "He kept us out of war." Reminds me of Lyndon Johnson in my own lifetime. Won an election in 1964 by a landslide on the grounds that he would not get us involved any farther in the war in Vietnam. And as soon as the election was over, whammo!
You're at war.
Yeah, he sent troops galore into Vietnam. Well, Wilson won the election the same way. He kept us out of war. Well, Germany began to be starving. For a while, Germany stopped its sinking of ships, but then they started starving, and they decided we've got to make an all-out effort to win this war. We've got to sink their ships. So they began to resume sinking of the ships again. The United States still did not go to war, even though many Americans were killed by the German U-boats sinking our shipping. And in those days, there was no good anti-submarine vessels like there was in World War II. That was invented later. Now, Here is what has got us finally to turn against Germany. The British government informed us that they had intercepted a telegram sent by the German ambassador in Mexico named Zimmerman. Zimmerman was communicating, of course, being a German ambassador, he was communicating with his government in Germany. But one of the telegrams he sent was an offer to the nation of Mexico, our enemy, that if Mexico would allow us to use their territory, if Mexico would allow Germany to use their